So I'm sure most people are aware, but the idea of Osu is not actually my original idea. There's a couple of Nintendo games. The developers are INIS.
Hello there, so I'd like to introduce you to the first Osu mapper. Well, not exactly, but Innis for sure is the first ever influence on mappers. Osu was initially designed as a simulator for a franchise of DS games, allowing map creation for whatever songs people wanted to play. Nowadays, it's rare to find an Osu player who cares for the original games, yet back when Osu was new, its audience was almost exclusively people familiar with those originals, and map design showed it. For a frame of reference, let's break down how Innis maps work. I've never played the original DS games, which is why I contacted an old mapper with close ties to the original games, and more importantly, the knowledge of how those games played a role in early Osu mapping.
Real name is Edgar, but people know me as Jens in Oz. I joined around August of 2008, 10 years ago.
Our conversation began with him explaining some of the fundamental features of Innis mapping. To sum them up, these maps exclusively follow the lead vocals in a song while using the most basic of basic symmetrical composition, avoiding any slider velocity changes, avoiding any hard-to-interpret overlaps, and prioritizing reading through approach circles. Unlike the average hard map today, just about anyone could understand the intentions behind Innis maps, and according to Jens, that was the point.
I think mostly it's a combination of small things, but they all work together to deliver the same message. Simplicity. Maps were designed this way to make the game objective clear, and so there's no ambiguity or readability issues. In other words, this is exactly the way you will present Us to someone who doesn't know about the game. It only makes sense for the game developers to aim to have readability as a priority, I suppose.
Being fairly straightforward, I don't think we need to sit here analyzing the details of Innis maps. The culture of Innis mapping on Osu, as pretentious as it sounds, is what I find more interesting to learn about. I've always found this period of time sort of mysterious because those familiar with it are generations long gone from the game. Jens even wasn't around from day one, yet even so, he was able to provide some insight into how mapping on Osu took shape.
Back in 2007, there were plenty of people who had influence from the original games, necessarily so since Oz was mostly known as an Ouendan simulator. What there was not, however, was structure or quality guidelines, nor even some kind of knowledge to actually make the maps look good or play well. Back then, I guess people felt like having a platform or maps that just existed were already a benefit in itself, so people didn't think it through that much. My very first map, Bittersweet Symphony, is... I don't even need to describe it, it's pretty awful.
So the ranking process was clearly not as challenging or competitive as it is now. Quality wasn't a huge concern, yet there was a form of mapping that a lot of people at the time associated with quality. Maps from the original games. Taking influence from the first source of theoretically good mapping made by a game design company, a number of mappers grew to represent that style in Osu.
It was not until later, in 2009, which things started to take shape among a specific circle of mappers. The mappers that I knew took influences from Innis, Echo, Lado, Diamond Crash, Natshinta, Jarvie, Random Gibberish. Right up until the very end, we kept mapping with the same philosophy.
That philosophy, again for clarification, being the Innis style.
Two names come to mind for who I think maps closely to Innis style most effectively, but I can't really decide which one comes out on top. M980 and MM201. M980's maps were mostly based off honoring the original games, so his design and mapping largely feels a bit more authentic and honest. He's the author of a very popular map I'm sure you know about, Don't Stop Me Now. MM201's approach, instead, was rather more systematic and reliable. As a developer himself, he at some point developed a tool to help translate the original maps from the DS-ROM file directly. Plus, he seemed to study and analyze the original maps down to the last nitty-gritty detail. I still remember MM201 back in the day complaining about how the bit snapping in a specific stage is wrong, but still though, I love the maps. They both faithfully adhere to these rules and philosophy. For example, they never did overlaps, and they used the same kind of break structure as the original games, which of course definitely has merit, as they still did super enjoyable maps working under these conditions.
Osu isn't bound to the same limitations as a DS though. You've got a larger screen and more controlled aiming, plus multiple buttons to click with, and multiple hands. That allows and did make for more challenging maps, requiring techniques unexplored in the original games, and in turn, even the mappers who prioritized this in this style later went into more complex territory like allowing themselves overlaps, streams, and slider velocity changes, despite those elements being avoided in official maps. From my inexperienced point of view, I always imagined the early progression of mapping in a sort of linear way. People began with influence from Innis maps, then went beyond their limits bit by bit, at the end of the road leading to something related to today's modern composition styles. According to Genzo, my assumption was completely wrong.
Right then from the start in 2007, you could easily tell there were two different kinds of mapping. There were people influenced by the original games, either directly or indirectly, and the ones who were not. For the latter, they instead mostly mapped in a freeform style. That kind of style has really been prevalent since the very beginning.
To dig a little deeper and satiate my own curiosity, I then asked about the map Cross Time. This is like, I think of it to myself as the hipster 2007 map, having weirdly modern style engaging rhythm for a map with only a double-digit set ID. It's what people today praise for being ahead of its time, and so I wanted to know what Innis mappers thought of it.
I do like that map, but I'm guessing that you must mean Cross Time.
Yeah, that's it.
Actually, the thing, and it's really interesting, these two worlds that I speak of, that they were divided by people who liked Cross Time and people who didn't. So
The INIS people, they didn't like it, would be my guess.
actually,
Or is it the opposite?
I would say the opposite. It follows the lead or vocals in the same fashion that the original games did. If you try to analyze it deep down, even though it had the irreverent spacing.
I'm very familiar with that, yeah.
Yeah, but still I do like it. It's the kind of map that you'll need to get through several retries to actually get it, but once you do, it's very fun.
So back on track, mapping's development was more like two separate branches. One that eventually died off as Osu disconnected from its identity as a sandbox DS game simulator, and another that thrived in one way or another up through today. And for reasons I said before, that sort of makes sense. The simplicity of the Innis style was rather limiting, and even with the changes its followers made to the style in Osu, it was still hard to compete with the freedom of a freeform style. Then that begs the question, who were the people responsible for bringing that freeform style to light?
Right from the start, there were people who never played the games and mapped freeform style, but to put a specific example, if you take a look at any early James map, you may be able to see what I mean. Even if it's in a sort of very primitive way, perhaps this was the absolute first predecessor to modern mapping now. James also went through some kind of evolution, but I do believe the first maps were the more freeform style. For example, the one that comes to mind is one from Final Fantasy VII, Crazy Motorcycle Chase, I think. Basically, if you play the harder difficulty, it's sort of just like a slider spam, but it's really freeform, or it's just built around anything. I don't know how to describe the modern mapping meta.
Based on what I've heard from pretty much every other old mapper, I can trust that James was a really important figure for this. It's important to remember though, I doubt there's any movement in mapping entirely backed by a single person, and I wouldn't expect anyone to be capable of attributing every map and mapper to the progress of mapping. Jens did tell me a bit about another mapper involved in the advances of freeform mapping though, as well as how that continued to expand onwards. I remember reading something on your blog about Chinese maps being the first group of freeform style maps, something like that.
That blog post was written like 5 years ago, so I didn't expect people to take me seriously. I do think that I got the kind of idea that Asian mappers started to popularize this kind of mapping. From my personal perspective, I remember the first impressions that I got from a modern, stylish map was thanks to ranking one of Nekketsu Rhythm's maps, Hatsune Miku Rolling Girl. It felt more organized than previous maps, while still being fast-paced and having natural movement all around. Plus, of course, the map didn't strictly follow the vocals or not in the same way as the original games, which is also a way of breaking out of the initial style. There may have been predecessors to that map, however, but at least for me, I can clearly recognize as one of the firsts, and which after that, I started to see it everywhere else. Natsume Ring was one of the firsts that I noticed, and perhaps this was what gave me the idea that this actually came from Asian mappers.
Given the evolution of this more liberal side to mapping, does that mean the now obsolete Innis branch is an inferior way of map design? The mapping choices made in the DS games are just like any other style, capable of expressing music even well enough to be rankable today, despite nobody attempting it. Being as basic and straightforward as these maps are is a good thing depending on your outlook, and a point made near the end of our discussion is something that I found really useful for aspiring mappers to keep in mind.
For a map to be good or unique, you don't need to resort to anything too complex. The original maps achieved this and were still simple as they can be. For example, if you try to take RRGUI's map, Exit Desert, Atmosphere, an awesome map which has really unique concepts and applies them in a very fitting way, if you're a new mapper trying to improve or expand your ability to map, you may look at the sliders which have really complex shapes and think that you're never actually going to be able to do that. You may start thinking that mapping is only reserved for the ones who have the touch, think mapping is just too hard, or you may block yourself out from trying out this sort of things. New people who got into Us after so many years with the modern mapping meta must have learned that this mapping style was the only good mapping style, or perhaps that inherently, since no one else does the other one is outdated, too boring, or is no longer accepted within the community. Perhaps people don't even know maps can be done this way, after being exposed to modern mapping during this time. Innis maps are just an example, but I believe there's really lots of potential as to how to do a map.
This whole idea makes me appreciate how simple Innis maps are. You are surely familiar with the sentiment along the lines of, learn the fundamentals before you experiment beyond them. You can easily imagine how applicable that is to mapping too. Because of how many fundamentals there are to master based on modern freeform mapping though, I fully understand how that task can feel impossible. Nothing about modern mapping is clearly laid out to a player and is rather hidden behind layers and layers of internal, subtle logic that needs extensively worded breakdowns to understand. You can't show an average player the newest ranked map and have them clearly explain why each object is placed how it is. It's just not gonna happen. People learning to map back at the very start though didn't have that struggle. They could follow in the footsteps of Innis maps easily because their mapping style was comprehensible to the lay mapper opening the editor for the first time. That inherent understanding is probably one of the things that made these maps fun for people as well. Unlike the low difficulty maps on today's map sets that can often feel unrelated to the music, Innis maps were easy enough to play while feeling connected to the music, even for people with no experience clicking or tapping circles. I, and likely you too, prefer new maps and their pompously over-detailed designs, but I can at least recognize that there's a charm to the simplicity of maps in the DS games. A charm that may have been lost along the way in Osu, and that makes mapping harder to engage with now than it was in simpler times. So yeah, thanks to Gens for talking to me, thanks to you for watching, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks.